Hi, all. I know that we previously talked about possibly starting our work by going next into health and sanitation, but I think because our first meeting had to do with the introduction to the environment rating scale and its scoring, I think by utilizing the components of substantial portion of the day and accessibility would be the next logical step for us to discuss and talk about. So I think that's what we're going to do today. It is very important for scoring and for assessment purposes. So I do want to make some points with this. And I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here for you. All right. Hopefully you can see that. So we're talking about substantial portion of the day as it relates to the ECHRS. And if you remember, ECHRS is for the older kids, the 30 months and up. So what is substantial portion of the day, or as we call it, SPOD? That means at least 1/3 of the time that the children are in attendance and that the center is open for business. Okay, so for example, it would be considered 1 hour out of a 3-hour program, or 3 hours out of a 9-hour program, 4 hours out of a 12-hour program, that type of thing. So that would be 1/3 of the day. If you were to look in your ECHRS book, you would see that SPOD is defined by the authors on page 7 of the ECHRS-R. And what it states is that in order to earn credit for an indicator that mentions substantial portion of the day, children must have access to that specific set of materials or spaces or activities, whatever's described in that indicator. And they have to have that access for 1/3 of the day based on the program's operating hours. This concept affects 11 different items. So it is really important to touch upon this when you're using the ECHRS-R, because it can greatly affect your scoring. And we're going to talk about how that is in just a minute. So here's a chart, and I'm going to email this to you as well. But this chart actually breaks it down for you, substantial portion of the day. So here is where the number of hours that you're open, and then how long a period of time children have to have access, or what's considered substantial portion of the day. So let's say if you're open from 6 in the morning till 6 at night, that's 12 hours. So naturally things would have to be accessible for 4 hours out of the day. Okay. So one of the things for you to think about is how many hours you are open, and using that previous chart, you would answer the question, what is the substantial portion of the day requirement for your program? And that's going to be another one of your assignments that I'm going to put in your email along with this. Just remember that it is based on the number of hours in operation. When we're talking about SPOD, or substantial portion of the day, we're talking about accessibility. So that's access to materials and activities. And so to determine whether or not materials are accessible, several factors are to be considered. The materials have to be within reach of the children in the group, and they have to be easy for the children to access. So if there's a lid on the container that they can't get off, or they're in a drawer, or a door on a locked cabinet, then it's not going to be considered accessible. The rule of thumb is if they can't reach it, unlock it, or open it, it's not considered accessible. The other thing to remember is if you tell them, no, that center's closed, or it's not time to do that, those are other considerations that would make these kinds of things inaccessible. So another question is how much child choice is possible? And do the children select the areas they play in? And does their selection give them access to space and materials? If the areas are limited to them, it will affect accessibility, just like I just mentioned. If you decide that all your centers are open except for dramatic play and blocks, then dramatic play and blocks can't be considered for accessibility unless they have had previous accessibility for that substantial amount of time that we mentioned. So this is why it is so important, because substantial portion of the day affects 11 different areas in the ECRS R. And when we're talking about 11 different areas, we're talking about scoring in those areas, and we're going to talk about that as we go along. But if you score low in these areas, you got to think about it. You're scoring low 11 different times. So that can significantly bring down your overall score. Remember from the previous assignment that your score is based individually and then it is averaged. Okay, so the first place in your ECRS R on page 14, you're going to see number 3, furnishings for relaxation and comfort. Basically your cozy area. Any place that there's softness provided for the children during their learning and play activities. You're going to see it come up under number 3 under 5.1. Cozy area accessible to children for a substantial portion of the day. If you look on that page 14, that's exactly where you'll see it. So if for some reason they don't have access to the cozy area for that substantial portion of the day, it affects that 5 column. And remember when we talked about you have to score a yes in everything in one column to move on or to even achieve the score in that column. So if you score no under 5.1, that means the highest score under that item would be a 4 or potentially even a 3. The next area where you'll see substantial portion of the day is item number 5, space for privacy. That's on page 16 of your ECRS R, and they define space for privacy as any place where 1 or 2 children can play, protected from intrusion by other children. So that could be if your cozy area is limited to 1 or 2 children, or if you have a Play-Doh table, for example, that's set up for 1 or 2 children, or a computer station that's for 1 or 2 children. Anything like that where 1 or 2 children can play together is going to be considered space for privacy. And that falls under the 5.2, space for privacy accessible for a substantial portion of the day. So again, that's in the 5 column. You don't want to score a no for that. Number 15 is next, your book area, books and pictures. You'll see that on page 34 of your ECRS R. That hits you a 5.1, a wide selection of books accessible for use for a substantial portion of the day. Next is number 19, your fine motor, your manipulatives. Page 39 of your ECRS R, 5.1, many developmentally appropriate fine motor materials of each type accessible for use for a substantial portion of the day. We'll probably at a later time go into what they're talking about as far as type and each type accessible, but for this module, we really are only addressing substantial portion of the day and accessibility. Next item would be number 20, art, on page 40. And again, 5.1, many and varied art materials accessible for use for a substantial portion of the day. Number 22, blocks, on page 44. 5.4, block area accessible for a substantial portion of the day. Number 24, dramatic play, that hits you under 5.2, materials accessible for a substantial portion of the day. Number 25, nature and science, on page 50 of your Eckers R, materials accessible substantial portion of the day. Number 26, math and number. Those materials have to be accessible for substantial portion of the day. Number 34, on page 63 of your Eckers, the item is schedule. And when they're talking about schedule, one of the things that will be considered for your assessment is not only what actually happens, but also what is observed and what is indicated on your written schedule. So you do have to make sure that your written schedule does indicate where your free play happens, where your substantial portion of the day occurs. And that hits you under 5.3. Substantial portion of the day is used for play activities. Is it actually happening? Is it written down? And can it be observed? Number 35 on page 64, the item is free play. And when the scales talk about free play, they define that as the child being permitted to select the materials and their companions, and as far as possible, manage play independently. So that means the children get to select where to play, who to play with, what to play with. That doesn't mean it's a free for all for children and you should put 12 children in the block center. By all means, doesn't mean that at all, but it means that children have choices and children can move around within the guidelines that you set for your classroom. One of the things that occurs sometimes when we're talking about free play is teachers may feel that it has to be fair for children to be able to access all the centers every day. So, which you do want them to have that accessibility. But if the teacher is to say, okay, 15 minutes, stop playing, move to the next center. 15 minutes, stop playing, rotate to the next center. That's not going to be considered free play for them. So it has to be their choice, and there is some manageability in there for you that you are allowed, but you've just got to be very aware that you're not limiting them or instructing them where they have to play and who they have to play with. Under this item, it hits you under 5.1. Free play occurs for a substantial portion of the day, both indoors and outdoors. And they do want to be sure that you have several free play periods scheduled daily, just to keep that in mind. So those are actually, that's it in a nutshell. That's what I wanted to discuss with you today. Just the importance of substantial portion of the day. And the idea that it does hit you in 11 areas and almost always hits you under the 5 column. So the one thing that you don't want to do is score poorly when it comes to substantial portion of the day, because that's 11 hits out of 43. And that really affects your overall average for that. Yep.